March 1943, Port Moresby, New Guinea. The Japanese General Staff still believed that naval dominance was maintained with armor, discipline, and destroyers in close formation. For them, the threat came from above, from strategic bombing at altitude, from aircraft carriers that still resisted the wear and tear of the Pacific. No general expected that the greatest risk to imperial logistics would come at the hands of an engineer outside the chain of command, working on the margins of doctrine. His name was Paul Irvin Gunn, former Navy officer, civil reactivated by necessity. And in those stuffy hangars where the heat mixed with the smell of grease and gunpowder, Gunn violated regulations, dismantled damaged aircraft, and rebuilt a new weapon. A bomber that didn't take to the skies. It descended to sea level. A frontal attack platform with 8 heavy machine guns spitting out 180 kilograms of shells per second. This documentary investigates how the illegal idea of an ignored technician turned the B-25 Mitchell into a surgical precision naval assassin, how American improvisation, unlike Japanese rigidity, produced effects that no general foresaw, because in that war the line between victory and humiliation was not drawn by admirals, it was welded in a hangar. But before we dive behind the scenes of this transformation, there's one statistic that defines it all. In just 40 minutes, a squadron of bombers modified by a single engineer outside the chain of command sank 12 Japanese ships, destroyed 4 war escorts, and dismantled the Imperial Navy's largest resupply attempt in the South Pacific. What was supposed to be a decisive breakthrough became a logistical massacre. There were thousands of deaths, tens of thousands of tons sunk, all caused by an aircraft that, officially, should not exist. A medium-range bomber turned low-altitude maritime predator, capable of attacking before any radar reacted. Japan expected clashes on the open sea. It received thunder on the horizon. And all this started with a wrench, oil in his hands, and an idea outside the doctrine. If you value the story told with accuracy and depth, consider leaving your like and subscribing. This helps this channel to continue revealing the silent decisions that change the course of the world. Paul Irvin Gunn did not seem, at first glance, the kind of figure destined to shape the strategic fate of a war. He was a technician, an aviator who had learned every bolt not in instruction rooms but in damp hangars, dismantling engines and putting life back into damaged wings. A former Navy officer, retired ahead of time, turned operational manager of Philippine Airlines. He was going through 1941 like so many other Americans in the Far East, far from politics, close to routine. When Pearl Harbor set the Pacific ablaze and the invasion of the Philippines turned civilian airports into targets, he was suddenly called up, not out of prestige, but out of necessity. The Army needed experienced aviators. Gunn was one of them. But for him, the war did not begin with the call, but with silence. His wife and 4 children were in Manila when Japanese troops surrounded the city. In the following weeks, as Gunn flew improvised missions, transporting medics and supplies, dodging enemy fighters and landing on dirt runways, he received only fragments about the family's whereabouts. With each flight, he returned to the ground with the same question: were they alive? When the final fall of the Philippines sealed the fate of American civilians, the answer came like a blade. The family was imprisoned in the Santo Tomas camp. From afar, Gunn faced the kind of pain that didn't inspire speeches. It inspired decisions. From that moment on, war ceased to be a map to become a debt. The regulations, once sacred to military aviation, became obstacles for a man who saw urgency where the state saw protocol. He knew how to fly, he knew how to repair, he knew how to improvise, and above all, he knew that the enemy would not wait for official authorizations. While entire Army units struggled with insufficient equipment and plastered plans, Gunn watched the American technological gap grow before his eyes. High-altitude bombers did not hit ships. The doctrine said to insist. He said it was useless. And this conflict, silent at first, would be the fuse for the most unlikely weapon of the war. But the difference between Gunn and the strategists was one that the Germans on the other side of the world did not understand either. The industrial and technical power of the United States thrived precisely on its deviations, not on its obedience. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to rigid hierarchies, believed that innovation arose only from authorized offices. The Americans, on the other hand, let their creativity boil in the hangars. Here comes a point that Germany has never been able to absorb. In 1942, while Gunn was disassembling and reassembling aircraft on his own, U.S. industry was producing more than 47,000 aircraft a year, almost triple the German capacity in the same period. This technical contrast reveals one of the biggest misconceptions of Axis military thinking. And if this statistic surprises you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins." What seemed to the Germans like indiscipline was, in practice, the basis that allowed men like Gunn to create solutions outside the doctrine. Every rivet changed, every weapon repositioned, every reinforced panel represented not only mechanical skill, but the materialization of a deep emotional impulse. Gunn never spoke openly about it, but everyone around noticed. He worked as if trying to keep someone alive. Engineering became an extension of a promise. Within months, senior officers realized that Gunn didn't just fly well, he thought better than many licensed designers. He distrusted theoretical models, he trusted practical results. Where manuals said not recommended, he asked why. Where experts claimed that medium bombers were not suitable for naval attacks, he responded with experiments, not reports. This mentality collided with the military bureaucracy inevitably. But, at the same time, he attracted commanders who, desperate for results, began to tolerate his rebellion. The strategic irony is clear. While Germany was stuck in processes, the United States began to reap the fruits of its own flexibility. The engineer outside the rules was about to become essential, and in a theater of war where ships decided to control islands, Gunn saw something few realized. The Japanese were not afraid of bombers. They feared the unexpected. So, in the shadows of canvas hangars, under the incessant noise of engines being tested, he began altering aircraft on his own, creating machine gun arrangements that didn't exist in any manual. It wasn't just technical daring, it was moral necessity. Each modification brought his family closer to a chance, however small, of surviving until liberation. But no superior at that time imagined what these experiments represented. Neither did the Japanese, who still believed that their navy could cross the Bismarck Sea with enough escorts to deter any threat. Gunn's gun wasn't ready, but history was about to put his theory to the test. Because before he perfected his illegal bomber, a Japanese convoy of nearly 7,000 troops was already moving silently toward New Guinea, and when Gunn heard about it, he realized that time was up. The next part reveals how this urgency turned an ordinary bomber into the most lethal naval machine in the Pacific. At the beginning of 1942, American air doctrine was still based on a tripod inherited from the First World War: altitude, precision, and strategic bombing. The B-17 Flying Fortress, with its 4 engines and extended range, was the symbol of this belief, an imposing bomber, designed to attack industrial centers, railway lines, and fixed targets at more than 7,000 meters high. But in the jungles of the Pacific, this doctrine proved obsolete. The flying fortresses flew too high, too slow, and against the wrong enemy. Instead of factories, Japan moved troops by sea. Instead of train lines, they were barges. The enemy was fluid, mobile, and knew how to hide under the canopy of the rainforests. The B-17s dropped bombs on the void of the ocean. The campaign's statistics reveal the absurdity. In 1942, less than 1% of bombs dropped by high-altitude bombers hit their maritime targets. Entire convoys crisscrossed the New Guinea coast with impunity, pouring fresh troops and supplies in the face of isolated and hungry Allied troops. And even in the face of this data, the High Command insisted on the manuals. The bankruptcy was not tactical, it was ideological. American generals trained in academies that still cited the Civil War as a reference maintained the illusion that the war would be won by height and not by proximity. In practice, the Japanese ships just changed course, adjusted speed, and waited for the bombs to pass through. The U.S. Air Force watched the war slip through the clouds as the Japanese solidified their lines on the ground. But not everyone followed the manuals. On the ground, drivers and technicians faced a cruder reality. They saw, day after day, the null effect of the bombings. They buried colleagues shot down by Zero fighters or anti-aircraft fire when poorly planned missions returned in silence. And in this scenario, figures like Paul Gunn began to gain space, not for the position, but for the result. Gunn did not write doctrines, he tightened screws. And in his view, war needed a new language: frontal fire, low flight, direct impact. While offices in Washington discussed optimal angles for vertical bombing, Gunn dismantled the nose of an A-20 Havoc and rebuilt it to fire forward. He did not seek approval. He was looking for efficiency, and he did. At the same time that Gunn began his artisanal trials in New Guinea, a frightening number crossed the internal reports. The Japanese had already established more than 300 coastal refueling points between the Solomon Islands and Indonesia. Small ports, makeshift runways, and supply stations sprang up like fungi along the coast, each powered by convoys that the B-17s couldn't stop. The Japanese maritime domain was built with medium vessels, protected by destroyers that sailed through murky waters and skies without real threat. American naval superiority was still a project. The Pacific wasn't an ocean, it was a supply corridor, and the high-altitude planes were simply flying too high to see that. In response, some units began to try alternative tactics on a local initiative: dive bombings, coastal strafing, night reconnaissance flights. But without doctrinal support, these actions were seen as dangerous improvisations, tolerated only in moments of despair. Real change would not come from above, it would come from below. This is where the contrast between the powers becomes evident. While the Japanese trusted in the rigidity and honor of form, and the Germans believed that innovation came from above, the Americans cultivated their most lethal force: practical decentralization. Officers like Gunn, armed with tools and a sense of urgency, were free to try. And when they got it right, the American machine knew how to scale, quickly. In a few weeks, what was an experiment with electrical tape turned into a combat pattern. This did not happen by accident. The industrial structure of the United States had already surpassed that of the Axis countries even before 1943. While Germany produced 325,000 tons of aluminum per year, the U.S. exceeded 1.2 million. The numbers were not only in the factories, they were in the hands of the technicians. Each makeshift workshop in the Pacific was supplied with volumes of parts, fuel, and armaments that Japanese forces could not even imagine. And this logistical difference was not clearly perceived by the enemy high command. In an intercepted Japanese intelligence report in 1943, an officer stated that American industry is strong but slow to adapt. This sentence would be disproved in less than 2 months. What the Japanese called slowness was actually the incubation of a new method of warfare, a method created in the shadows, on the fringes of the chain of command, with pilots sleeping in canvas bags and mechanics operating by the light of flashlights. And in this organized chaos, the B-25 began to transform. A medium bomber, stubbornly designed for medium-altitude missions, would be shaped for point-blank combat. The logic of the war was being reversed. The skies were no longer the exclusive domain of strategists and became a workshop for operational engineers. And as the Japanese threat increased in the Pacific Islands, the need for real solutions eclipsed doctrinal debates. Paul Gunn wasn't the only one to see this, but he was one of the first to act. In the next part, we will reveal how the first modified bombers began to cross the skies of New Guinea and why, in a matter of weeks, the Japanese would realize that the enemy would no longer come from above. It would come close to the water, carrying the weight of American industry on the trigger. In the stuffy interior of canvas hangars covered in red dust and the smell of burning oil, Paul Gunn began a process that would never appear in a technical manual, but that would change combat doctrine in the Pacific. Faced with damaged aircraft, spare parts, and scarce time, he saw not the limitation but the opportunity. The A-20 Havoc bomber, originally designed for conventional attacks at moderate speed and altitude, became the first candidate for transformation. Gunn ignored factory specifications, ripped out the bomb bay, and replaced the nose of the plane with a reinforced aluminum panel, on which he himself installed 4 Browning 50 machine guns, fixed for frontal firing. The concept of the strafer was born, a bomber redesigned to breathe direct fire at land and sea targets, flying close to the ground. It was the end of distance, the end of the abstraction of combat. Unlike traditional bombing, the strafer required the pilot to see the target in the eye. For Gunn, it was the only way to stop fast ships, camouflaged between islands. The bomber became a kind of aerial gunboat, fast, deadly, and daring. The first improvised versions were equipped with simple electrical systems for simultaneous firing of the machine guns, adapted with parts from broken radios and dismantled generator wires. To aim, pilots used handmade markings on the windshield. There was no electronic sight nor an operating manual. There was trial, error, and results. In reconnaissance and coastal attack missions, early strafers proved their effectiveness by destroying light convoys and patrol craft with unprecedented violence. Japanese crews reported hits so low that shells hit the hull and cabin at the same time, piercing the deck before any anti-aircraft response was possible. Gun also began to adapt the ammunition feed systems, extending the autonomy of continuous fire from 5 to more than 15 seconds, an eternal time in low-altitude combat. Empirical tests showed that the lower the plane flew, the lower the chance of being detected by radar, and the greater the psychological impact on the targets. Field radios began to record a new type of report, planes that did not come from above, but from the horizon line, shooting without announcing their presence. The A-20's structure, while versatile, revealed limitations for larger payloads. It was time to aim higher. Gun turned to the B-25 Mitchell, a twin-engine medium bomber, originally designed for strategic range missions. With a robust fuselage and room for extensive modifications, the Mitchell was the perfect platform for a new generation of strafers. In secret, Gun coordinated mechanics to remove the bomb bay, seal doors, reinforce the forward fuselage, and install up to 8 forward-facing, 50 machine guns lined up for convergence at 500 yards. When the first modified B-25 took off, the gun itself was on board. In a test flight, the plane fired a volley of 180 kilograms of lead per minute, enough to rip a patrol ship in two. The sound, according to witnesses, was continuous thunder. In practice, each B-25 now carried the firepower equivalent to that of a light destroyer, but with the mobility of a fighter. The weapon was ready, but not approved. The High Command did not yet know, or pretended not to know, what was being born in the hangars of New Guinea. Gun subversion grew at the same speed as Japanese convoys crossed coastal routes with impunity. It was a race between time and stubbornness. But on the other side of the planet, the Germans also made the same error of judgment. A Luftwaffe report, dated January 1943, stated that the Americans did not possess consistent low-altitude attack doctrine, and that medium bombers posed no significant naval threat. This analysis, written by trained officers at the strict German precision bombing school, ignored what was already happening in the Pacific. He ignored the sound of 50s piercing hulls. He ignored the fact that in that very month, 17 Japanese ships had been destroyed by planes without doctrine, but with excess ammunition and courage. The irony is that the doctrine the Germans were hoping for came, but not from the generals. It came from the hands of an American engineer who did not ask permission. Shaft of reused screws and welded sheets urgently. Germany underestimated American improvisation because it could not imagine it working at scale. But that was exactly what was about to happen. The next installment will show how General George C. Kenney, upon encountering Paul Gunn and his modified planes, broke with official bureaucracy and turned what was illegal into authoritative doctrine, launching the deadliest phase of the air war in the Pacific. When General George C. Kenney arrived in the Southwest Pacific Theater in mid-1942, he found more than a battlefield saturated with mud, jungle, and poorly executed decisions. He found an air force in functional collapse, trapped in ineffective bombing doctrines and commanded by officers who still believed that accuracy was a matter of altitude, not impact. But Kenney was not a bureaucrat. Coming from a lineage of pragmatic officers, he had distinguished himself not by following orders but by delivering victories. And it was this mentality that made him stand in front of a hangar in Port Moresby, look at a completely modified B-25 outside aviation regulations and ask, who did that? The answer was simple: Paul Gunn. And instead of punishing him, Kenney made the decision that would change the course of the air war in the Pacific. He promoted Gunn, gave unfettered access to hangars, authorized serial modification of aircraft, and ordered experiments to become standard. For the first time, the operating instinct trumped the manual. Kenney understood that winning didn't just require airplanes, it required vision, and he saw in Gunn the spark that was missing. Together, they created what no office in Washington dared to approve: a fleet of bombers turned into front attack platforms, armed to the teeth and flying low enough to rip off enemy ships' antennas. The impact was immediate. Missions began to be planned based on the logic of the field, not on the cartography of theory. Each modified B-25 carried not only lead, but a new doctrine: arrive fast, fly close, and fire into silence. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. The reports started coming in. In less than 2 months, units equipped with strafers were twice as effective against naval convoys. The time between target identification and impact has been reduced by 70%, and the trust between pilots and command has increased like never before. Meanwhile, traditional doctrine still insisted on bombing at altitude, now compared among the officers themselves as throwing stones at fish. In an unofficial letter, Kenny wrote, "We are not here to preserve rules. We are here to shorten wars." Germany, true to its vertical doctrine, could not conceive of this kind of flexibility. A Luftwaffe memorandum from March 1943 stated that the Americans were overly dependent on improvisation and that this made them predictable in their disorganization, but that was the wrong reading. American improvisation was, in fact, a system that fueled innovation from the field, not from the top. The American chain of command tolerated, absorbed, and multiplied. And Kenny, by breaking the link of blind obedience, accelerated this gear. In a matter of weeks, hangars throughout New Guinea were retrofitting bombers with jigs sent by the gun himself. Machine guns came in batches, ammunition was prioritized, and the sky began to fill with grazing thunder. The Japanese would call this new type of attack the invisible roar, but they still didn't know what would come next. The next installment reveals how the B-25 was transformed not just into a tactical weapon, but into a symbol of America's ability to bend metal, time, and strategy, even force the enemy to surrender. The B-25 Mitchell, born as a medium bomber of versatile use, was designed for medium-altitude attacks, horizontal bombing and support missions. Its bomb bay, long fuselage, and mid-wings reflected a philosophy of warfare based on distance, cadence, and meticulous planning. But this philosophy would not survive the reality of the Pacific. When Paul Gunn got his hands on this model, he saw more than a bomber. He saw a rugged carcass, fast enough to evade fighters and spacious enough to carry not just bombs but rage. The transformation began in the nose. Literally, the bomber compartment was ripped off. In its place, Gunn installed 8 Browning 50 machine guns, lined up for converging fire. Each barrel adjusted millimetrically to concentrate impact at less than 500 meters. This meant that for about 5 seconds, the plane would spit 180 kilograms of shells per minute directly into the bow of a ship, shells capable of piercing steel, fuel, and human flesh with equal ease. To sustain the brutal retreat of this arsenal, the front structure of the plane was reinforced with internal duralumin plates and naval steel supports, reused from fuel tanks. Gunn also redistributed the weight of the aircraft by adapting the center of gravity, with extra ammunition magazines in the center of the fuselage. None of this existed in the original project. Everything was done under practical calculation, with manual goniometers and experience accumulated in years of maintenance. The rear fuselage received reinforcement to contain excessive vibration, and the ammunition feed mechanisms were repositioned to allow for longer bursts. Gunn did not think about evasive maneuvers. I thought about total impact. The side armor was adjusted to protect the pilot and forward gunner from ship's shrapnel, and a second optical sight, improvised from navalized binoculars, was attached to the cockpit. It was a weapon of attack, not defense. Each converted B-25 lost autonomy, but gained ferocity. The pilots were trained to maintain level flight within 30 meters of the sea, a suicidal altitude for conventional bombers, but ideal for avoiding radar and anti-aircraft detection. The approach would be made at maximum speed, with formation in a straight line, machine guns firing even before the targets were accurately identified. The engines were also tweaked. Gunn ordered the use of enriched jet fuel mixtures, which allowed sudden acceleration, even at the expense of life. In Gunn's logic, the issue wasn't longevity, it was effectiveness. Each mission was worth more than the engine. The tests began quietly. The first B-25 strafer was taken to the runway still with weld marks showing, without official identification, and with parts from other aircraft. When it took off, the noise of the 8 machine guns tested simultaneously silenced skeptical commentary. The shots didn't just work, they turned the plane into a new entity. In simulations against decommissioned coastal vessels, the impact was so destructive that engineers present doubted the repeatability. But Gunn was not seeking approval. He sought multiplication. In less than a month, 5 B-25s were converted, and with Kenny's informal authorization, the hangars became centers for serial adaptation. No plane left the same as the other. Each unit learned from the previous one. The fusion between industry and improvisation was reaching its peak. While the Japanese calculated routes based on predictable bombings, the sky began to creak with machines that ignored altitude, logic, and precedent. Germany, which still viewed American medium bombers as inaccurate and fragile, did not even consider the possibility that the B-25, used until then in conventional missions in Europe, was being transformed piece by piece into a flying cannon. In a Luftwaffe field diary, a doctrine instructor recorded, "American doctrine is fragmented, which yields inconsistent results." But what he called inconsistency was actually adaptation. What looked like clutter was rapid iteration, and what seemed like a workaround was emotionalized engineering. Because Gunn wasn't just creating an airplane, he was shaping a promise. Each bolt tightened was a step toward shortening the war. Each successful shot was a muted nod to his wife and children imprisoned in Manila. It was technique guided by instinct, mathematics driven by urgency, and in this vortex between logic and despair, the machine was ready. When the first full squadron of strafers took off in formation, there was no announcement, there was no parade, but there was silence. Those who scoffed at the idea kept silent, because in the air, above the dark green Pacific Sea, there was now flying something that belonged in no manual, a bomb-free bomber, an unauthorized attack plane, a gun that spewed steel at the level of the waves. The next part reveals the first real test in combat, and what happens when 12 of these monsters appear on the horizon, even before the Japanese radar reacts. In the midst of urgency and improvisation, a forgotten idea was unearthed by Paul Gunn, like someone who finds a lost weapon in ruins. The skip bombing, a rudimentary, almost folkloric technique, tested in simulations in the First World War, and then abandoned by cabinet strategists. But Gunn didn't seek elegance and he sought impact. The logic was simple, almost primitive. Drop the bomb so low and at such high speed that it bounced off the surface of the water, like a boulder bouncing in a lake, until it hit the hull of the enemy ship below the waterline. What seemed inaccurate to the doctrinaires, to Gunn was applied physics. A 500-pound bomb dropped about 60 meters high, at more than 400-kilometer range, would maintain the horizontal trajectory for a few seconds before exploding with a programmed delay in the belly of the ship, where no external armor could protect. The tactic matched perfectly with the profile of the new B-25 strafer: low flight, approach in a straight line, saturation of machine guns, and, at the final moment, the steel jump. The initial tests, carried out against the carcasses of decommissioned ships in isolated areas of the New Guinea coast, were so destructive that they left the pilots themselves silent. In a single attack, 3 B-25s destroyed a support vessel in less than 90 seconds. The hull was broken in two, with the bomb detonating in the boiler bay. The efficiency was cruel. Unlike precision bombing, which relied on altitude, visibility, and millimeter calculation, skip bombing only needed speed, courage, and a straight line. The pilot kept his nose level, fired his machine guns to eliminate anti-aircraft artillery, and in the final second dropped the bomb. There was no time for correction. There was no margin for error. But when he got it right, and most got it right, the result was terminal. The genius of the technique lay in its simplicity. It attacked a ship's most vulnerable point, the waterline. Japanese vessels designed to withstand vertical impacts and submarine torpedoes had no response against a bomb that bounced in the water like an arrow and exploded in the engine. In addition, the psychological impact was devastating. Field radios began recording reports of crews abandoning posts before impact. In one of the intercepted transmissions in April 1943, a Japanese operator shouted, "They come from the horizon, not from the sky." The Imperial Navy itself began training lookouts to look ahead, not up. American doctrine was rewriting itself in real time, not in manuals, but in the hands of pilots. Skip bombing turned bombing into hand-to-hand combat. It was no longer a matter of dropping a bomb and waiting. It was about aiming, jumping, hitting, and seeing the explosion up close. The technical impact of this tactic generated a new cycle of modifications to the B-25s. Conventional bombs received timer adjustments, with delay fuses carefully calibrated so that the explosion occurred after the hull penetrated. Attack formations began to fly in pairs, one plane saturating with machine guns, another making the jump. The coordination was rehearsed in improvised fields, with instructions passed between pilots with chalk, maps, and ropes on the ground. Washington would not learn of the tactic until weeks later, and even then with skepticism. For traditional command centers, dropping bombs without sight, without altitude, and without formal authorization was tactical heresy. But the results did not ask for an opinion. They were screaming. In a single week, 7 medium-sized ships were destroyed by attacks that mixed frontal fire and jump bombardment. And in the field, the doctrine was born with its own name: low-level attack. Low-altitude attack became standard in Kenny's squadrons. It was the end of vertical air warfare, and the beginning of tangent air warfare, where planes did not hover over the theater of operations, but pierced it like raging spears. Germany, stuck in its doctrine of strategic bombing with formations at altitude, had no preparation to adopt or understand such an approach. Its Ju-88s and He-111s still operated under the logic of Stukas, where the terror came from diving, not from the sea line. In an intercepted report dated May 1943, a German officer described the attacks in the Pacific as tribal tactics of an undisciplined air force, unaware that those tribal tactics were being refined by engineers, field-tested, and adapted with the precision of a wartime industrial laboratory. It was precisely this union between field and factory, between urgency and adaptation, that made the American Air Force a living creature. While the Germans perfected procedures, the Americans perfected results. And if this seemed like disorder to the Europeans, it was because they had never been hit by a bomb that leapt out of the water like an invisible predator. The next part delves into the first definitive test in real combat. A Japanese convoy of 16 ships, protected by fighter jets and anti-aircraft, is attacked by B-25s armed with front machine guns and jump bombs. What happens in 43 minutes redefines not just a battle, it redefines the concept of bombing. The first attacks by the modified B-25s began without trumpets, without official reports, and without any awareness on the part of the Japanese that a new phase of the war was beginning. The hangars at Port Moresby still bore the smell of fresh welding when the first converted aircraft took off for Japan's Buna airfield. The goal was simple: to destroy aircraft on the ground and test the effectiveness of the frontal attack at low altitude. But what happened that dawn would silence any doubt. As the B-25s emerged close to the treetops, Japanese watchtowers barely had time to sound the alarm. The roar of the R-2600 engines combined with the thunder of the 850 machine guns firing in a converging fashion devastated the anti-aircraft positions before any operator could reload. Enemy planes on the ground were swept away like leaves in the wind, burning in a row, burning fuel and ammunition. To the Japanese, it looked like a suicide attack, but it wasn't. It was the first calculated demonstration of a new method of combat, entering so low and so fast that the anti-aircraft defense barely had time to lift the barrel. Allied intelligence reports recorded Japanese astonishment. In intercepts, some officers called the attackers heavy fighters because the idea that it was a bomber was too absurd. No manual provided for bombers attacking with frontal bursts. No Japanese naval doctrine envisioned facing half-inch shells fired from less than 50 yards off the ground. The technical surprise was total. The psychological surprise, even greater. In the next attack, on Leh, the effect was even more devastating. The Japanese defenses believed that the previous blow had been isolated. They were wrong. This time, Gunn and Kenny used mixed formation, strafers clearing the way, A-20s equipped with cluster bombs close behind, and P-38s at altitude to isolate any interceptors. The result was an entire airfield destroyed in minutes. The scene, described by pilots who participated in the mission, was one of pure devastation: hangars collapsing, ammunition exploding in a chain, and Japanese soldiers running senselessly, unable to identify where the attack was coming from. The military impact was clear, but there was something bigger going on. For the first time, the Pacific was witnessing a kind of coordination that combined technical improvisation with industrial capacity. Every plane destroyed on the ground was a machine that Japan could not replace. Every pilot killed was an irrecoverable loss. Each depot burned was fuel that would not return to the front. Here comes a fact that the Axis powers completely ignored. In 1943, the United States manufactured more aircraft than Germany and Japan combined managed to put into operation during the entire year. If this number surprises you, leave it in the comments. Shocking data. As the attacks intensified, The Japanese began to register a recurring expression in internal reports. Unidentified planes, coming at speed and low altitude. Unidentified. That said it all. What Gunn had created in the hangars was unprecedented, unfamiliar, and unfamiliar. Japanese pilots attempting to take off were shot down before taking the wheels off the ground. Artillery operators complained that there was no time to aim, let alone calculate distance. Heavy anti-aircraft were rendered useless. The Leh base, one of the most important on the Japanese Eastern Front, spent days collapsing. From there, Gunn and Kenny expanded their training. American pilots learned, at a fast pace, to fly so low that they felt the sea spray touch the canopy. Gunn personally taught the procedures: convergence of fire, millimeter alignment, ammunition economy, and the courage needed to fly straight into a wall of steel that, ironically, would never have time to fight back. Each test mission was a lesson, each lesson an evolution. The hangars became laboratories. Technicians worked through the night, testing fixings, reinforcing plates, installing improvised electrical systems. The pace was so intense that within a few weeks entire units were converted to the doctrine of frontal assault. For the Japanese, it was as if the U.S. Air Force had materialized overnight, a completely new weapon. Most strikingly, none of this had received formal approval. It was war-shaping doctrine, not the other way around. But there was an indirect consequence, as lethal as machine gun fire. Growing panic among Japanese garrisons. Whispers spread from island to island. The attack was coming from below. The attack broke antennas. The attack destroyed planes before they took off. The attack, some said, gave no warning. The war was changing, and changing fast. What began as artisanal experimentation transformed, in a matter of weeks, into a force that rewrote maps, routes, and high-command decisions. Still, nothing that had been done so far would compare to what was to come, because in late February 1943, Allied intelligence intercepted a Japanese message that would change everything. A gigantic convoy, carrying nearly 7,000 troops, was on its way to New Guinea, one of the greatest of the war. And in the silence of the radars, Gunn and Kenny realized what that meant. The time had come to prove definitively whether the weapon they created would be capable of destroying not only bases, but the logistical heart of the Japanese Empire. The next part will show how this encounter turned a daring theory into the largest naval annihilation ever brought about by aviation in such a short time. Before dawn on March 3, 1943, the sea still seemed calm, but each wave hid an omen. The largest Japanese resupply force sent to New Guinea was advancing slowly, relying on the same doctrinal assumptions that had guided the empire since 1941. Heavy ships, destroyer escorts, air cover, and the rigid belief that American bombers would only attack from above. This certainty, as solid as the breastplate of the hoofs, would be destroyed before noon. At 10 a.m., the sky over the Bismarck Sea opened up in multiple directions, revealing something the Japanese had not understood in the previous attacks. An entire air force reshaped by force coordinated for a single purpose. First came the B-17s, bombing at medium altitude, not to hit, but to force the ships to maneuver and break the formation. As destroyers zigzagged and transports tried to escape, the real attack was approaching close to the sea. The Japanese lookouts saw only gray shadows crossing the horizon, too low to be bombers, too fast to be torpedo boats, too big to be fighters. They were the B-25 strafers, the bombers transformed by Paul Gunn into flying gunboats. When they emerged only 50 feet from the water, the sound of the engines became indistinguishable from that of 50 machine guns spitting out 180 pounds of shells per second. The first bursts ripped off antennae, cut portholes, blew up machine gun nests, and tore through the deck. The suppression was total and intentional. It was the prelude to death. American pilots had been tearing through the sea like aluminum arrows. From the Japanese point of view, the sequence was illogical. Bombers approaching without climbing, medium planes firing like fighters, bursts coming from the nose instead of the turrets. Japanese naval doctrine, trained to react to vertical dives or side torpedoes, simply froze. The first bomb jump decided the fate of the Kyokusei Maru. The bomb dropped at close range, touched the surface of the sea, bounced once, then another, and hit the hull below the waterline. 5 seconds later, the internal explosion raised a black column that broke the ship in two. On the next ship, the Kembu Maru, 3 strafers attacked in sequence. In less than a minute, the deck was swept away, the bridge destroyed, and the command system lost. The jump bombs hit the engine room, flooding the hull in moments. One of the destroyers tried to react, but the B-25's front machine guns fired at 300 yards without pause, silencing the artillery before it could rotate. The Shikinami tried to protect the convoy by making smoke screens, but the B-25s came so low that they pierced the veil as if it were fog. Then came the second wave. If the first destroyed the defense, the second handed down the sentence. Transports burning, destroyers maneuvering without coordination, Japanese pilots unable to take off, everything combined in a scenario of naval collapse. In just 43 minutes, 4 transports were sinking, 2 destroyers had been destroyed, and more than 2,000 soldiers were in the water, many of them unaware of what had hit them. The accuracy came not from sophisticated sights but from technical repetition and lethal logic created in the hangars. Effectiveness came not from formal orders, but from the freedom Kenny had given Gunn. The doctrine was not born in Washington. It was born in the jungle in the noise of improvised tools. It was the American war reinventing itself as it fought, and the Japanese discovered this too late. At noon, the pilots returned to rearm. In the afternoon, they would return to finish the job, sinking those who were still trying to escape. The Imperial Navy would never again assemble a convoy of this size in New Guinea. The next part will reveal why this attack, technically simple, industrially cheap, and tactically daring, rewrote the very logic of war in the Pacific and altered the fate of an entire theater of operations. By the time the final reports of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea reached command centers, the coldness of the numbers seemed to contradict the scale of what had happened. The Japanese convoy had departed Rabaul with 8 transports carrying some 6,900 troops, many veterans, all of whom were essential to reinforce Lay's front, escorted by 4 experienced destroyers and supported by more than 100 Zero fighters in rotation of cover. In theory, it was a protected force, calculated to cross the most guarded sea route in the Pacific. In practice, it was destroyed so quickly and so completely that it would take Japanese analysts weeks to accept the obvious conclusion. The American low-altitude attack had created a new form of annihilation. Of the 8 transports, none reached their destination. All were sunk in successive attacks that combined frontal volleys and jump bombs. Of the 4 destroyers, only 2 managed to return, both severely damaged. Official estimates indicated that more than 5,000 Japanese soldiers drowned, burned, or trapped in flooded basements, and thousands of survivors had to be rescued by submarines and small boats, turning the operation into a desperate evacuation. The contrast with American losses was almost grotesque. 1 B-17 shot down, 3 P-38s lost, and 13 crew killed. The math was too brutal to be challenged, and yet she only revealed half the story. The other half was in precision, coordination, and psychological effect. The American attacks did not come in chaotic waves, but in calculated succession. The first blow came from the B-17s, which forced the convoy to maneuver and break its rigid formation, a formation built to counter horizontal torpedoes and vertical dives, not to defend against low-flying bombers. Then bow fighters and B-25 strafer entered, tearing through the sea surface at maximum speed, firing on exposed crews, anti-aircraft guns, and superstructures. To top it off, jump bombs were dropped less than 300 meters, at an angle so low that it turned the ocean into a ricochet track. Ships were hit not where they were strong, but where they were flimsy, below the waterline. Japanese naval doctrine, built to withstand Stuka's dives or British torpedo boat attacks, simply had no defense against this logic. And one of the cruelest ironies of this episode is that no Japanese designer had considered the possibility of ultra-low horizontal bombardments. No manual provided for this. No exercise trained this. No commander expected this. Gunn's creative disobedience, backed by Kenny's operational flexibility, turned a handful of medium bombers into surgical weapons. Aerial photos taken after the battle showed the sea covered in debris, oil slicks, and scattered survivors. It was a scene of strategic rupture, not just tactical, because Japan didn't just lose ships. It lost the ability to supply its land front by the theater's most important route. He lost troops that he could not replace. He lost confidence, and it lost something even more fatal, the dominance of initiative. For American intelligence, the impact was immediate and mathematical. An internal memo written a few days later said, "The enemy will no longer be able to reinforce Leh to significant levels. From this moment on, the theater is ours." The sentence was simple, the meaning devastating. The disciplined, rigid, hierarchy-based Japanese doctrine had been defeated by mechanics working with flashlights attached by wires, by engineers improvising machine gun mounts, by pilots trained in weeks for tactics that Washington had not yet officially approved. And this is where the contrast with the German mentality becomes evident. That same year, the Luftwaffe still insisted on medium bombers operating as traditional platforms, ignoring reports that showed the United States produced more than 4,000 aircraft a month, a figure that made any static doctrine such as the German one quickly obsolete. While Berlin doubled down on its rigidity, the Pacific showed that flexibility, improvisation, and industrial capacity were lethal weapons. The Japanese only understood this when they watched, bewildered, the remains of their convoy sinking in less than an hour. The shock was so great that a Japanese naval report, discovered after the war, described the battle bitterly. We were not prepared for a weapon that does not exist in our manuals. What they called the weapon that does not exist was, in practice, a new philosophy, and she was just getting started. Because after the victory in the Bismarck Sea, Gunn and Kenny received full authorization to expand the Strafer program, and the next installment will reveal how this expansion, industrial, tactical, and psychological, transformed the B-25 from an improvisation war into a continental-scale system of destruction. The sound came before the vision, a deep metallic rumble that vibrated in the water as if the sea itself were being battered. For Japanese soldiers, this sound quickly ceased to be just an American radial engine. It became a warning, an omen, a sentence. After the Bismarck Sea, every Japanese report of aerial approaches repeated the same pattern: immediate panic, disruption of communications, and hasty abandonment of positions. The psychological impact of the modified B-25s was so profound that on several islands, entire garrisons began to disperse at the slightest mechanical echo from the horizon. This did not happen by chance. The Gunn and Kenny doctrine didn't just reinvent the way to attack, it reinvented the way to be perceived. The B-25s came so low that they seemed to touch the water, so fast that they exceeded the rotational speed of Japanese anti-aircraft machine guns, so noisy that any attempt at command was swallowed up by the rumble of 50 firing in convergence. To the Imperial Navy, which had been trained to react to vertical attack, it seemed supernatural. In radio intercepts, Japanese operators described attacks as blasts from the void, monsters cutting through the sea, or bombers that descend without falling. The most disturbing thing was the unpredictability. Bombers at altitude could be heard, monitored, and anticipated. Guns' attack did not. It appeared at the limit of visual range, and in 5, 7, 10 seconds, the deck was on fire. A report by Rabal described the feeling coolly. Low-altitude bombers cannot be spotted in time to prepare defensive operation. They asphyxiate the field before it breathes. The psychology of Japanese maritime warfare, founded on honor, discipline, and courage in the face of the visible enemy, collapsed when the enemy became invisible until the last moment. Even veteran destroyers with trained crews began to fail in basic operations. In May 1943, a Japanese commander reported that his men abandoned the guns before the aircraft were within 200 meters. Such was the level of trauma generated by the first attacks. Some historians have called this psychological avoidance, others, of silent moral collapse. But for those who lived on deck, it was something simpler. Pure fear. The sound of the Wright R-2600 engines, when it echoed between island slopes and reefs, created a resonance that distorted spatial perception. Japanese testimonies described the feeling of being surrounded, even when only 2 or 3 B-25s were present. Acoustics worked against the enemy. The moral impact was magnified by the brutal look of the attacks. The strafers arrived spitting fire before they were even fully identified. Japanese crews described flashes from tracers as white lines cutting through the air, horizontal cuts, levels of light that confused the eye. At a base in Solomon, a garrison recorded that the attack was so fast that there was no time to decide whether it was better to run, shoot, or pray. Disorientation made each attack not only destructive, but humiliating. Japanese doctrine valued coordinated attacks, strict discipline, and ceremonial execution. The Strafer doctrine destroyed all this. It was dirty, unpredictable, dishonorable to Eastern eyes, and precisely for this reason, devastating. Japanese medical reports began to record a new type of wounded, soldiers unable to return to their post after surviving low-altitude attacks. Many had tremors, loss of focus, hypervigilance, and uncoordinated motor responses. Today, it would be diagnosed as combat trauma. At the time, he was treated with silence and shame. In American intercepts, translators began to identify linguistic patterns that betrayed this fear. Expressions such as the curse sound, the wings that bite the sea, and the engines that bring death appeared repeatedly in Japanese accounts. The cultural impact was also profound. For a force that valued strategic predictability, doctrinal rigidity, and the clear distinction between fighter, bomber, and torpedo bomber, facing a hybrid that ignored categories was a direct moral blow to the heart of the Japanese naval hierarchy. It was as if the enemy had broken the rules of the game itself, and there was something more subtle, something that few historians observe, but that the witnesses of the time felt deeply. The B-25 strafers forced the Japanese to look down. For the first time in the war, the danger came from sea level, not from the sky. This symbolic reversal had an almost mythological effect on the troops. Heaven was the spirit realm, the sea, the physical domain. Mixing both broke expectations built by generations of training. The mere presence of the B-25s in coastal regions began to alter patrol patterns. The Japanese began to avoid daytime navigation, reduce movements, cancel landings, and transfer operations to night hours. Many of these changes were direct reactions to the psychological impact, rather than the material, and while the Japanese sank emotionally, the Americans ascended technically. With each successful attack, gun adjusted the formula. It improved the harmonization of machine guns, changed bomb timers. It reinforced structural plates. I trained new pilots. The B-25s became more than weapons. They became symbols. They represented what happened when the war found engineers free of bureaucracy and commanders willing to rely on results, not manuals. Germany watched these reports with skepticism. In Berlin, aviation analysts called the American tactics uncontrolled, uneconomical, and statistically unsustainable. But what the Germans called indiscipline was actually what they lacked: efficient industrial improvisation. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japanese trauma grew with each new appearance of the low-pitched sound of Mitchell engines. And this trauma would not be temporary. It would shape decisions, delay operations, and erode the confidence of veteran sailors. But the apex was yet to come. The next installment will reveal how the psychological weapon also became an industrial weapon, and how American factories began mass-producing increasingly powerful versions of the monster that was born illegally in a makeshift hangar. News of the massacre in the Bismarck Sea crossed the Pacific like an electric shock, but, curiously, the first responders were not generals. They were engineers. When technical reports began to circulate describing a medium bomber equipped with 8 frontal machine guns, converging bursts, jump bombs, and stable low-altitude performance, North American aviation realized that something deeply out of the playbook had worked so overwhelmingly that it could not be ignored. Thus, in mid-1943, civil engineers were sent to the Pacific to observe, record, and measure what Gunn and his makeshift teams had created with borrowed tools, scrap metal, and sleepless nights. What they found wasn't a workaround. It was a working prototype of a new generation of attack aircraft. Every structural reinforcement in the nose, every machine gun mount, every adjustment in the center of gravity was the result of real combat, not laboratories. And American industry, unlike Germany, had a strategic virtue. It absorbed innovation without wounded pride. Instead of rejecting what was not born in its offices, North American decided to make illegality the norm. The first step was to measure. Engineers disassembled one of the B-25 strafers down to the last rivet. Comparing it to the original plans, they discovered that Gunn had created a completely new weight distribution system, adapted to the violence of the 50 recoil. Instead of condemning the modifications, they concluded that they were solid, repeatable, and scalable. The second step was to replicate. Within weeks, factories began adapting assembly lines to incorporate solid noses, reinforced brackets, and convergence testing, until finally the improbable became official. The B-25G, a bomber that came standard with a 75mm cannon in the nose, as well as frontal machine guns. It was the first time in American history that a medium bomber rolled off the production line with a fixed anti-ship gun. And this was only possible because the U.S. industrial system could do what the Axis could not: turn improvisation into doctrine and doctrine into assembly line. Here it is worth pausing because the contrast is brutal. In 1943, while the Americans standardized on an experimental bomber, Germany was still struggling to produce enough medium bombers, suffering from shortages of aluminum, skilled labor, and reliable engines. American aircraft production was about 6 times higher than Germany's that year, a figure that many German analysts simply refused to believe. If this surprises you, comment, "Logistics wins." The B-25G paved the way for something even bigger. The Model H improved the internal layout, brought more machine guns and an even more integrated cannon, sacrificing the co-pilot to compensate for weight and make room for the armament magazine. It was a monster of steel, made to tear through ships and destroy land positions with brutal efficiency. And then came the B-25J, the final synthesis, thousands of units produced, with some variants equipped with as many as 14 front-facing machine guns, the most heavily armed bomber of World War II. Each iteration showed the same industrial logic: listen to the field, absorb what works, eliminate what doesn't, and iterate at scale. Guns improvisation had grown into an entire family of aircraft, built by thousands of workers in factories that were breaking monthly production records. It was a dance between countryside and industry that no Axis country could imitate. In Japan, engineers were forbidden to alter approved designs without express permission from the high command, and that permission almost never came. In Germany, fear of Hitler paralyzed independent initiatives. In the United States, on the contrary, any idea that worked gained ground regardless of its pedigree. The U.S. Air Force began sending daily reports to North American, describing performance, failures, and opportunities for improvement. It was as if the front and the factory were talking continuously. This integration would be decisive for the rest of the war, because as new B-25Gs, H, and Js arrived in the Pacific, Gunn didn't just test them, he molded them into increasingly accurate weapons. The adjustments he made in the field were immediately sent to the production lines, which in turn returned even more efficient aircraft, creating a virtuous cycle that multiplied tactical capabilities in a matter of weeks. No Axis country had this speed, and it was this speed that transformed an illegal invention into an industrial armed wing, capable of hunting ships, sweeping airfields, and shaping the fate of an entire campaign. But if the industry was now involved, it remained to be understood how the gun himself pushed his creation to the limit, and how he personally would put the 75mm cannon to the test in real combat. The next installment will reveal the flight where the creator himself tested the weapon in the heart of a Japanese destroyer, in an attack so daring that it would become a legend inside and outside the Air Force. The transition from the handmade strafer to the B-25H was less an evolution and more a mutation, an industrial metamorphosis that transformed a medium bomber into something no designer in 1939 would have dared to foresee: a front-attack air cruiser, capable of firing more metal per second than many light ships. The process began with direct observation by North American aviation engineers, who saw in the field what no laboratory had predicted. Gunn's bomber worked because it brought combat to the distance where Japanese doctrine died. So in redesigning the B-25 for a new generation, the engineers made a radical decision. If the war was now horizontal and violent, the nose of the aircraft needed to be more than armor. It needed to be a weapon. The B-25H was born. Its solidified nose housed not only multiple 50 machine guns, but a 75mm M4 automotive cannon, derived from Sherman tanks, adapted with a reduced recoil system to be fired in level flight. The visual and physical impact of that armament redefined the concept of the bomber. The aircraft did not need diving, it did not need a torpedo, it did not need an escort. It was on its own, a 15-ton artillery platform capable of piercing hulls, demolishing bunkers and dismantling coastal positions in seconds. The integration of the cannon required profound changes. The B-25H lost the co-pilot's position to compensate for weight. The dorsal turret was shifted forward to improve the center of gravity. The fuselage received extra reinforcements, and the internal systems were rearranged to prevent the 75mm ammunition from interfering with stability in flight. The gun itself was manually operated by a crew member in the nose, while the pilot kept the aircraft steady during the approach. In tests, the firing was so violent that it shook the entire structure, but American engineering found a point of balance. Short, precise shots always combined with machine guns, allowing saturation before the main blow. The operation of the B-25H required unusual technical discipline. Pilots needed to calculate distance, speed, and alignment accurately. The gun had a low rate of fire between 4 and 6 rounds per minute, but each 14.7-pound shell was devastating in itself. In a typical attack, the sequence was simple and brutal. Low-altitude approach, frontal bursts to suppress, a single 75mm shot to break the target, and low escape before the defense could react. It was the perfect fusion of field courage and industrial logic. In the Pacific, the impact was immediate. Japanese coastal positions, once resilient, began to be destroyed with a combination of concentrated fire and high-yield explosions. Patrol ships were opened like cans. Landing craft were turned into smoke towers in seconds, and for the first time, a medium bomber could defeat a destroyer without outside support. The Japanese were stunned. Their reports described bombers that shoot like ship cannons and guns that break the water and hit us. Japanese doctrine based on compartmentalization, fighters fighting in the air, bombers overhead, ships on the surface, simply did not recognize the possibility of a hybrid that could do everything at once. The operation of the B-25H also revealed an ironic element. The weapon with the greatest impact was not the 75mm cannon, but the constellation of 50 machine guns that saturated the front space. In some attacks, the high-velocity shells destroyed targets before the cannon was even fired. But the symbolic value of the cannon was undeniable. It turned the aircraft into an icon of technological domination, a reminder that American industry had the capacity to turn improvisation into doctrine and doctrine at scale. By 1944, production of the H models had reached hundreds of units, each more refined than the last. And with that, American aviation gained something that no other air force of the war had, an attack platform that combined armored vehicle firepower with air mobility. Meanwhile, Germany was still locked in sterile internal debates about heavy bombers, operational jets, and reorganizations that never materialized. The Luftwaffe never produced an equivalent to the B-25H. He never understood that the war had changed its axis, and he never realized that by underestimating America's ability to turn an illegal innovation into an industrial program, he was condemning his own operational flexibility. The next chapter will show the moment when Gunn himself, now recognized by the industry, decides to personally test the most daring creation of the project, and how this encounter between machine and creator resulted in an attack so precise that it would become a technical milestone within the United States Air Force itself. When modified B-25s ceased to be experimental rarities and began to form entire squadrons, the Pacific changed geography. The Japanese routes once busy have become risky corridors, watched by planes that always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. The secret wasn't magic, it was logistics, and it was here that American industrial strength showed its true muscle. In Wewak, for example, the strafers carried out one of the most devastating attacks of the entire campaign. The Japanese air base, key to protecting New Guinea, was turned into ruins in a single morning. The operation was only possible because the Americans improvised extra fuel tanks inside the bomb bay, manually dumped during the flight to free up space, in a procedure that no manual would allow, but that all crews learned to perform with precision. The extended range allowed dozens of B-25s to attack simultaneously, destroying 174 Japanese aircraft on the ground, an irreversible blow to the backbone of enemy aviation in that region. In Rabaul, the Japanese Empire believed it possessed its invincible fortress. It was the largest military complex in the Pacific, other than mainland Japan, but confidence evaporated when 38 B-25 strafers appeared flying so low that they disappeared behind the waves before emerging strafing in crossfire. They attacked ships, depots, hangars, and shore positions in perfect sequence, coordinated with P-38s at altitude and phosphorus smokescreens. 30 ships were destroyed or seriously damaged. There, the B-25 ceased to be just a bomber. It became a strategic chokehold tool. If something moved, it attacked. If something did not move, it destroyed it as well. The irony is that Japan expected a classic naval war, battleships against battleships, aircraft carriers against aircraft carriers. Instead, it encountered an enemy that had turned a medium bomber into a predator of logistical routes. In the Philippines, the dominance of the B-25s was even more symbolic. As land forces retook islands such as Leyte and Luzon, strafers swept through Japanese supply lines. Coastal convoys, once protected by aircraft and small armed boats, have become easy prey. Strapping supply barges, destroying camouflaged warehouses in mangroves, and cutting supply trails were routine tasks. The cumulative effect was devastating. Without food, ammunition, and fuel, thousands of Japanese soldiers were isolated, turned into ghost garrisons unable to fight or retreat. The empire that had advanced aggressively in the early years of the war was reduced to pockets of resistance surrounded by a 24-hour aerial machine. And all of this was only possible thanks to American logistical capability, a capability the Axis never understood. Each B-25 squadron had maintenance crews capable of dismantling engines, changing mounts, realigning machine guns, improvising structural reinforcements, and installing field modifications in less than a night. The American bases were living, adaptable organisms moved by thousands of workers. Germany and Japan, tied to rigid and centralized industrial chains, never achieved this flexibility. In the United States, factories produced parts at an absurd pace. In the hangars of the Pacific, mechanics adapted these parts with workshop ingenuity. The result was an aviation that never slowed down, never paused, never waited. On islands such as Biak, Nomfor, and Morotai, the ritual was repeated. A makeshift runway was built, barracks appeared out of nowhere, fuel was poured from drums lined up like Roman columns, and in less than 48 hours, the B-25s were already attacking the next target. It was industrial warfare at the speed of the jungle. The logistics were so powerful that Gunn was able to test a modification in the morning and have it replicated on dozens of planes the next day. A machine gun convergence adjustment, for example, was adopted across the fleet in less than a week, after pilots reported drastic improvement in frontal assaults. This was unimaginable in the Luftwaffe, where modifications took months to be approved. In the Pacific, it took hours. In 1944, during the Philippine recapture campaign, strafers destroyed more than 200 small and medium-sized vessels, barges, transports, freighters, and auxiliary vessels. Most were shot down not by torpedoes or bombardment at altitude, but by frontal bursts and bombs dropped at low altitude. Japan could not replace these losses. The American system, on the other hand, continued to grow. By 1944, the United States was producing about 96,000 aircraft a year, a number that alone surpassed the combined output of Germany and Japan. And while the B-25 wasn't the most famous of the American planes, it was certainly the most adaptable. It could take off from short runways, operate unescorted, attack land and sea targets, and return still in one piece after absorbing damage that would destroy any Japanese aircraft. The logistical mastery was also manifested in the training. American crews went through accelerated cycles, learning in weeks what other forces took months to teach. Actual experience was incorporated into the training almost instantaneously, creating a cycle of continuous improvement. At some bases, newly arrived pilots flew as co-pilots on real missions 48 hours after disembarking, because the war machine wouldn't stop. Each strike mission took off sustained by an invisible army of cooks, engineers, radio operators, meteorologists, weapons technicians, runway firefighters, hangar builders, crane operators, and ammunition specialists. Each of them was a cog in a larger machine that Japan could never imitate. And the more the machine turned, the more the Japanese empire shrank. By the end of 1944, the B-25 dominated not only the sky, but the sea between the islands. The Pacific, once controlled by the Japanese Navy, had become an American board. But one piece was still missing, the most personal piece of this whole story. Gunn, the man behind the invention, still struggled with the silent pain of knowing that his family remained trapped in Manila, and it was this pain, mixed with technical conviction, that pushed him to his most daring attack. In the next part, we will see the moment when the creator of the weapon decided to use it personally against a Japanese destroyer, in an attack that would reveal the human and moral limit of his own creation. Japan's collapse began not with an explosion, but with a silence. The silence of ships that stopped leaving, of ports that stopped receiving fuel, of soldiers that stopped eating. After the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, the Japanese Empire discovered that it wasn't just vulnerable, it was predictable. Every sea route, every attempt at resupply, every night displacement became an opportunity for the predator created by Paul Gunn. The B-25 Strafer, now armed, tested, and multiplied, began hunting not only during the day but also in the dark, equipped with improvised radars, hastily trained operators, and pilots determined to turn the Pacific into a logistical wasteland for the enemy. And the irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. The Japanese strategy, built on the belief that it could sustain distant garrisons with large protected convoys, imploded. After Bismarck, these convoys became unviable. What remained were slow, fragile barges unable to cross open areas. They moved at night, almost always glued to the coast, waiting to camouflage themselves in the darkness. But the problem is that the Americans also moved at night, and unlike barges, the B-25s had range, speed, and now had maritime search radar. Japan had lost not only the sea, it had lost the right to move. Between 1943 and 1944, the number of Japanese vessels destroyed in resupply operations grew so exponentially that the Imperial Army itself began to record inevitable losses as part of the routine of its units. In the Gulf of Huon, for example, more than 70% of the barges used to transport rice and ammunition were destroyed in less than 3 months. Each night, small flotillas set out with renewed hopes. At each dawn, only charred wreckage washed ashore. The B-25s flew low, detected residual heat, engine trails, reflections on paddle blades, any clue that differentiated dead wood from moving wood. Once the target was found, destruction was instantaneous. Frontal bursts, cluster bombs, and coordinated attacks with P-70s and Beaufighters completed the job. In the Pacific theater, the war became a metabolism contest. The Japanese had to send food every day. Americans had to prevent it, sometimes only once a week, and this asymmetry was fatal. In New Britain, entire garnishes reduced their ration to 400 calories a day. On Bougainville, soldiers reported eating boiled grass mixed with tree bark. On Manus, commanders sent desperate reports that more men die of starvation than of gunfire. The B-25 didn't just fire bullets, it fired days without rice. America, for its part, fed its aerial machine with a power of production that the Axis could never match. In 1943, as Japan struggled to manufacture a few hundred new aircraft per month, the United States was producing more than 8,000 aircraft every 30 days. That meant more pilots, more mechanics, more spare parts, more ammunition, more fuel. Maintenance teams could use an entire week just to test experimental adjustments, because they knew the industrial flow would never dry up. The result was brutal. Japan needed miracles. The United States needed only routine. The B-25s, strengthened by this structure, became a symbol of inevitability. They appeared where they shouldn't be. They appeared in areas where Japanese radar did not detect them. They operated in regions considered inaccessible. At Kapingamarangi, a barge was attacked more than 900 kilometers from the nearest U.S. base, an attack made possible by the use of makeshift supplemental tanks, a technique Gunn helped develop. From then on, each besieged Japanese island turned into an unfettered prison. No isolated garrison expected to be reinforced, and the officers, reading daily reports, understood that the United States had created the first truly mobile air force of the war. What impressed Japanese analysts was not only the efficiency of the attacks, but the speed with which American tactics evolved. Within 6 months, the strafers had gone from hangar experiments to standardized weapons, integrated with intelligence, supply, and communication networks. Japanese doctrine, built with pride on rigid concepts and strict hierarchy, crumbled in the face of an enemy who treated ideas not as dogmas but as disposable tools. American supremacy wasn't just technical, it was cultural. While Japan feared violating rules, the United States prospered by breaking them. By the end of 1944, the effect of this strangulation was already irreversible. On Leyte, Japanese units attempted to send supplies using floating drums pulled by swimmers. In Mindoro, they used empty fuel canisters for improvised flotation of ammunition. In Biak, intercepted reports indicated that soldiers went days without drinking water, and the B-25s continued to fly overhead, hunting for anything that moved toward the coast. Japan didn't just lose battles. It lost time. No supplies, no fuel, no food, no ammunition, no ships. That was the real blow delivered by the B-25s. A blow that didn't make headlines, but it decided wars. And it is precisely at this point that surprising documents emerge. Confessions by Japanese officials stating that, after Bismarck, any maritime operation within American range amounted to suicide. But history still reserves a decisive point: the moment when the creator of this chokehold, Paul Gunn, decided to use his own weapon in combat, facing a Japanese destroyer with a 75mm cannon. The approaching attack was not only military, it was a personal catharsis. In the next part, we will see the confrontation in which Gunn's war ceased to be technical and became intimate, and the result that even he himself did not foresee. Paul Gunn went through the war as if carrying two fronts at the same time. The visible one, where the B-25 Strafer destroyed Japanese convoys and changed the course of the campaign in the Pacific, and the invisible one, where a father counted days, imagining his wife and 4 children surrounded by barbed wire in Manila. Each mission that his planes fulfilled was, for him, an indirect attempt to shorten the distance between life and loss. From the outside, history saw him as an insubordinate inventor. Inside, he was a man consumed by a silent fear, the fear that when the war was finally over, there would be no one waiting. The arrest of Polly and the children in January 1942 was the blow that broke her sense of the world. He was not a theoretician, he was not a bureaucrat, he was not a drawing board engineer, he was a hangar floor technician who knew how to make machines work. And at that moment, it was all he had left. His work became his language. Each bolt tightened had the weight of a promise. Each weapon fitted had the sound of a racing heart. In the early months of the conflict, when Manila was plunged into hunger, disease, and terror, Gunn tried to send letters that often did not arrive, and received garbled, censored messages, where only 2 or 3 sentences survived the Japanese sieve. He read every word as if it were a map to locate his family in the chaos. The reports that came to him from the Red Cross were painful fragments. "We are alive. The children are fine. We have hope." But between these lines were huge spaces where anything could be happening, and that uncertainty fueled the momentum that turned an ordinary bomber into an unprecedented weapon. For many officers, the Strafer was a technical project. For Gunn, it was a message sent to the entire Pacific. He would not be paralyzed by pain. His colleagues began to notice that while other men rested, Gunn worked quietly in stuffy hangars, lit by the harsh light of lamps that hung like interrogations. His hands, burned by the heat of the welds, were the same ones that wrote careful letters to his family, trying to convey strength without revealing his own despair. The mechanics commented that Gunn almost never slept, and when he did, he was seated in a chair, still with his overalls stained with oil. He moved as if every minute without working was a minute robbed of the chance to meet his children again. The air war for him was not a strategy, it was an urgency. There was a brutal connection between intimate pain and technical creation. The greater the anguish, the more radical the idea. When Kenny authorized him to turn the B-25 into something never anticipated, Gunn didn't just see operational freedom, saw an opportunity to hasten the end of the war. He knew that every train destroyed brought Japan closer to logistical exhaustion, and every day that Japan weakened was one less day in his family's captivity. With each successful mission, he imagined, perhaps naively, that a bag of rice would arrive at the Santo Tomas camp, that a guard would relax his vigilance, that his children would have a little more strength. And when intelligence reports began to indicate that the Japanese garrisons were hungrier, more tense, more disorganized due to the air blockade, Gunn read it all not with pleasure, but with a grim feeling. It was the price paid to save lives he loved. The moral weight was devastating. He was helping to destroy the enemy that had taken his family, but he also knew that any reprisal could fall on the very ones he was trying to protect. It was cruel mathematics, and no military formula solved this equation. During the years of separation, Gunn kept a near-secret ritual. He kept in his overalls pocket a faded photograph of Polly and the children, taken before the war, when Manila was still a place of sunshine and tranquility. He consulted her in the most difficult moments, as if the image were a compass that pointed to the moral north of his war. Several times, crew members watched Gunn stare out at the sea after night missions, motionless as if searching for something beyond the horizon. Perhaps the past he had lost, perhaps the future that had not yet arrived. His silence became a part of his reputation. He was not a man who talked much, but when he talked about his family, his voice changed, acquiring a firmness that neither explosions nor injuries could tear away. In 1944, when his wounds finally took him out of combat flight, Gunn received a letter that crossed the world weeks late. Written by American volunteers after a partial inspection of the St. Thomas camp, it said only, "Your wife and children have been seen. They are alive." It was the first time in 3 years that he had direct confirmation. His colleagues said Gunn, the man who faced anti-aircraft fire and naval guns, sat and cried silently. His inner war was harder than any mission. And as the Japanese Empire began to buckle under the weight of American aviation, Gunn found that his creation was helping to pave the way for his family to reunite. But the reunion had not yet arrived, and the next chapter of the story reserves the moment when the siege finally closes, the instant when the sound of Allied engines echoes over Manila, and Gunn's war, both external and internal, approaches the outcome he has waited for years. The gates of St. Thomas opened with the dull rumble of a rusty hinge, and the sound that followed, screams, footsteps, cries, orders, marked the end of 3 years of darkness. On the morning of February 3, 1945, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division advanced through the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, where thousands of American civilians lived under starvation, disease, and constant threats of execution. Among them were Paul Gunn's wife, and the 4 children of the man who, on the other side of the Pacific, had turned American attack aviation into an instrument of strategic chokehold. The reunion did not come immediately. It came in echoes. The reports, sent first by military telegraph, then by messengers, finally by liaison officers, reached Gunn as disconnected fragments. The camp has been taken. The Gunn family has been located. They are alive. In that instant, the war he had waged since 1942 ceased to be a continuous line of metal, gunpowder, and engines. It became palpable, intimate, human. Polly had survived mock executions, extreme rationing, and the growing terror of the Japanese guards as the empire retreated. The children had become adults by force. Paul Jr. and Nathan carried the gaze of those who saw hunger up close. Connie and Julie had learned to hide from fear. When American soldiers broke through the gates, they found a population reduced to shadows, but alive, and that, for Gunn, meant real victory. He was in Australia, still recovering from the blast that shattered his shoulder and ended his ability to fly, when he received the definitive news. The message, delivered by the American command itself, was simple. Your family will be transported immediately to meet you. The same man who had overseen airframes, adjusted convergence of arms, and built an entire air doctrine outside the rules, now trembled as he imagined the moment when he would see his sons again. There was no military manual for that. When the military transport landed on the makeshift runway, Polly descended first, thin, exhausted but intact. The children followed close behind, hesitantly, as if they feared that it was all another brittle dream after years of captivity. Gunn walked up to them with the rigidity of someone who had learned to endure physical pain in silence. But when he reached them, the military posture he had maintained out of habit collapsed. He fell to his knees, hugging the children with the arm that still worked, while Polly held him as if rediscovering the world. Witness accounts say that no one dared to speak. Mechanics, pilots, officers, all were silent in the face of that scene that no medal, no strategic report, no map of operations could describe. That was the real end of the war for Gunn. The months that followed revealed the extent of what had been lost and the value of what had been saved. The children faced bouts of chronic hunger. Polly described nights when the camp believed it would be executed at dawn. Gunn was trying to understand how the public war he fought in the skies was connected to the private war his family waged behind barbed wire. The irony was painful. As his planes destroyed ships, strengthened offensives, and accelerated campaigns, he himself did not know whether his own home would survive the next month. And yet every successful mission, every Japanese convoy sunk, every warehouse destroyed had shortened their time of suffering. It was not the American victory that freed his family. It was the small victories accumulated by men like him who dared to think differently and act outside the doctrine. Japanese logistics collapsed. The garrisons weakened. Manila became vulnerable. The release took place before the guards carried out the final order of execution. The strafer wasn't just a weapon, it was a watch. Each gust hastened the end of Polly's and the children's imprisonment. At the reunion, Gunn's war dissolved. He did not seek glory, he did not want to be credited with. His closest friends report that, after regaining minimal physical strength, Gunn spent hours in silence just watching his children sleep, as if he needed to convince himself that they were real. The war had molded in him the exact coolness to create new ways of killing, but it had also preserved a fierce, almost primitive tenderness, dedicated only to one goal: to bring his family back. The military victory in the Pacific was celebrated with flags and speeches. Gunn's victory was celebrated in a single house amid silent embraces, where a father relearned the sound of the voices he feared he would never hear again. But the narrative does not end here. St. Thomas's release marked the end of Gunn's war as a father, but not the end of the military impact of the man who reinvented American air attack. In the next part, we'll explore what the post-war era revealed about its creation: declassified documents, Japanese reports, and American assessments that confirmed that the strafer didn't just win battles, it rewrote the rules of modern warfare. Paul Gunn's legacy began long before he was recognized, and continued long after his name disappeared from official reports. When he left the service in 1948, promoted to colonel and marked by permanent injuries, Gunn retired without speeches, without self-promotion, and without any intention of claiming glory. To many, he was just a veteran driver with a talent for machines. For military history, though, he would become the invisible link between the desperate improvisation of the Pacific and the doctrines that would shape air warfare for decades to come. The modifications he made to the B-25, the concept of concentrating frontal firepower, turning a bomber into an attack platform, and bringing the aircraft closer to the target to the point of acting as mobile artillery, were studied in American, British, and ironically, German tactical schools in the post-war period. The essence of his thought, born in makeshift hangars and fueled by moral necessity, was transformed into a technical principle: dominate the battlefield by controlled saturation. This evolutionary line becomes clear when observing the emergence of the first modern aerial gunboats. In Vietnam, when AC-47 Spooky began circling over villages, destroying enemy concentrations with lateral bursts, many analysts noted the philosophical similarity to Gunn's work. It wasn't the bomber that descended to the target, it was the gun that found the weak spot and stayed on it. The AC-130, which emerged years later, took the same logic to the extreme. Instead of M2 machine guns, it carried 20mm cannons, 105mm howitzers, and advanced sensors. But the doctrine was the same: approach, aim continuously, saturate the enemy until neutralizing him. Technical reports from the Tactical Air Command, declassified decades later, state that the persistent fire platform was directly inspired by the results obtained by the strafers in the Pacific, especially the psychological impact, the accuracy at low altitude, and the ability to disrupt enemy logistics with very few aircraft. In the Cold War years, when the U.S. sought an attack plane capable of destroying Soviet armored columns, the A-10 Thunderbolt II was born carrying the same philosophy: a plane that does not bomb from afar, but that dives, attacks, resists the damage, and repeats the blow. The ironic detail is that the GAU-8 Avenger, the 30mm cannon of the A-10, produces enough recoil to momentarily reduce the aircraft's speed, a phenomenon identical to what the B-25 strafers experienced when firing 8 50 machine guns simultaneously. The engineers called this an operational constraint. Gunn would call it Tuesday in the hangar. The influence of Gunn's insurgent thinking also appears in the tactical field. For decades, strike squad instructors have taught a principle that does not appear in any pre-war manual. The rule is to win, not to follow rules. This teaching, repeated at air bases from Alaska to the Persian Gulf, is often attributed to General Kenny, but in interviews recorded after his retirement, he himself said, "I just gave the order." Gunn set an example: the American model of flexible leadership, the ability to accept outside ideas, to turn improvisation into doctrine, and to elevate non-commissioned officers and technicians to the role of strategic solvers. All of these formally became part of the Air Force's culture after 1945. In the archives of Air University in Maxwell, Alabama, there is a phrase often quoted by instructors: "For every general who follows doctrine, there is a technician who saves it." They don't mention Gunn's name, but everyone knows who they're talking about. His heritage also materializes in quiet places. At Barrancas National Cemetery in Pensacola, his grave is simple, barely visible among thousands of others. Visitors who know his story leave small empty ammunition cartridges on the tombstone, as a symbol of the power he unleashed. not against people, but against the tyranny of military rigidity. And in aviation museums across the country, especially the National Air and Space Museum and the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, there are panels devoted not just to the B-25 but to the concept it ushered in, the weapon born of disobedience. An entire room in Dayton displays photographs of the first modified models, alongside field reports that prove their effectiveness. It is the institutionalization of rebellion, the moment when the system admits, without its kind, the war could have been much longer and much bloodier. But Gunn's greatest legacy may not be in technique, doctrine, or engineering. It is in the message that his actions send to any generation that faces seemingly immutable challenges. War, like life, is made of rules, but won by those who are brave enough to break them when they no longer serve. That notion echoes from veterans who served in the Philippines to pilots who flew over Iraq in 2003, all claiming that the freedom to think, adapt, and improvise is the difference between moving forward and perishing. Japan believed in rigid hierarchies. Germany believed in technical perfection. Gunn believed in solving the problem. And this principle, so simple, brought down empires. And if his story seems complete, the last layer is still missing. The final reflection that ties technology, morale, and the human impact of this war. Because the question that remains is not just how he changed the war, but why. And in the next part, we'll see how the story of Paul Gunn, the gun he created and the world he helped shape, forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. It's not the gears that win wars, but men who dare to turn them in another direction. Paul Gunn's story doesn't end with him. It ends with what his boldness revealed about the very logic of war. When the B-25 Strafer emerged in the Pacific as a low-lying predator, it destroyed more than Japanese ships. It destroyed the rigid belief that war is won only with doctrine and hierarchy. And as we observe the total collapse of the Axis powers, especially Germany, it becomes impossible to ignore the decisive contrast. While Berlin relied on uncompromising principles, perfect design, and centralized leadership, the United States operated with tolerance for error, technological elasticity, and an industrial system capable of transforming improvisations into mass production. What began as an illegal hack in a stuffy hangar became a symbol of a fundamental difference. American power lay in its ability to adapt, to accept unofficial solutions, and to turn individuals into force multipliers. At the end of the war, captured German pilots confessed that they did not understand how the Americans could lose planes and continue attacking as if nothing had happened. It was simple. They had the industry, they had the fuel, they had the logistics, and above all, they had the freedom to break rules when they stopped working. From Gunn's journey emerges a universal lesson. No matter how perfect the plan, how technical the manual, or how rigid the doctrine, no strategy survives the encounter with an industrial machine capable of generating more planes, more ammunition, more fuel, and above all, more ideas. Logistics does not support the strategy. It defines the strategy, and when combined with the courage to challenge established thinking, it creates results that surpass the foresight of any enemy. That is why when Germany assessed its defeat in 1946, one of its generals concluded with bitter irony, "We were not defeated by tanks, we were defeated by trucks." The phrase sums up our entire story, and also the world that Gunn helped shape. If you value deep research and the rigorous reconstruction of these decisive moments, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel to support our quest for historical truth. Comment on which piece of data shocked you the most in this video: the Strafer's firepower, the psychological impact, or the brutal scale of American logistics. And ring the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact we're going to reveal. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next real story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.